So on this episode, I'm going to show you how to lose your friends for just $13. Now, why exactly do you want to lose your friends? I'm not sure, but I am helping you do so, and again for the low price of just $13. Who knew losing your friends could be so affordable and budget friendly? So with all that said, let's jump into it. And the commander that is going to help you lose your friends for just $13 is Baral, Chief of Compliance. Baral is a 1/3 human wizard for 1 in a blue that says, instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So Baral is a commander that helps you cast more and more spells and also benefits you whenever you counter an opponent's spells. So, while many play groups out there are okay with a couple of counter spells, some might not enjoy you countering every single one of their spells. Okay, that might be exaggerating just a bit too much, but yeah, we are going to be running an absurd amount of counter spells in this deck, to the point where your opponents will not think they can cast anything without it getting countered. Every single time they try to do something, they're going to be worried that, well, you've got like 18 counterspells waiting. The frustration is going to keep building throughout the game as your opponents keep getting denied and you just keep saying no, 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 and no. You know, a blue player's favorite word. And while you're countering all their spells again, while they are, well, very, very sad, you are very, very happy because you just keep getting to draw cards and discarding cards. You get to keep looting to find even more, you guessed it, counter spells. And one of the best, or maybe I should say worst parts about this commander is that you can really hyper-target a player if you really want to and start making deals with other players and being like, okay, I won't counter your spell as long as you don't swing that creature at me, and now I'm just going to keep countering this other player's spells again and again and again so they can get absolutely nothing through. Which of course is a fantastic way to lose that friend forever. Which of course is the point of this deck. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, and like you saw in the thumbnail and the description everywhere, essentially, yeah, this is just a $13 deck, so it's a very budget-friendly way to lose your friends. So yeah, every single card in this deck is incredibly budget-friendly, and even though Baral itself is like $4, yeah, the rest of the deck will then, I guess, it'd be around $9, so yeah, very budget-friendly cards to annoy your friends and lose them. And with the cards I'm going to be talking about on this episode, I'm going to be going through them in different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And one final thing, if you are interested in this deck and are interested in losing your friends, well, make sure you check out the deck list link in the description below. And now with all of that said, let's jump into the deck. First up, let's ramp with cards like Sky Diamond, Mana Geode, and Commander Sphere. Sky Diamond enters the battlefield tapped, it can tap for a blue. Mana Geode enters the battlefield and we scry 1, and it can tap for 1 mana of any color, and Commander Sphere can tap for a blue and we can sacrifice it to draw a card. Keep in mind with our Commander's cost reduction, that can pretty much take care of a lot of generic mana out there, so it is important that we have our mana rocks tapping for a blue. So we're also going to be running Letter of Acceptance, Bonder's Ornament, and Network Terminal. Each of them can tap for 1 mana of any color and can provide us with some card advantage. Letter of Acceptance, we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it. Bonder's Ornament, we can pay 4 to tap to draw a card. And Network Terminal, we can pay 1 to tap and tap another untapped artifact we control to loot. And when it comes to drawing, Decanter of Endless Water can help us as well, because it says you have no maximum hand size, and of course it can tap for 1 mana of any color. Honored Heirloom and Vessel of Endless Rest can each tap for 1 mana of any color as well. With Honored Heirloom, we can also pay 2 to tap and exile target card from a graveyard, and Vessel of Endless Rest has, when it enters the battlefield, put target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. So if we counter an opponent's spell and we really want to get rid of it, either of these can really help us out. And speaking of helping us out, finally we also are going to be running Naiad of Hidden Coves, which says as long as it's not your turn, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this can help us reduce the cost of our instants and sorceries further, or again, if our commander is not in play, still help us with our counter spells. Now, as good as many of the cards are in this deck, there is one that stands above the rest in my opinion, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck. So the Golden Pig of this deck, the number one card out of our 99 is Telepathy. Telepathy is a very simple enchantment that costs a blue, and it says your opponents play with their hands revealed. This is incredible in this kind of a deck and with this kind of a strategy, well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, first up, this is an incredibly salt-inducing card, and this can really upset your friends when you play it, especially when you play it on turn one, because now your friends have to show off their hands, and you don't have to at all for yours. So you have perfect information on what all of your opponents have, and they actually have information on each other's hands, but no one knows what you have, so everyone can see what kind of threats each other have, except for your threats. And of course, because you can see their threats and see what kinds of plays they might be making, you can plan for what spells you need to be countering, which makes this incredible. So you're not, wasting counterspells on things that you don't need to counter when you know that there's something much more threatening that might be coming. And of course, when your opponents are playing against a deck like this one, and when they know that they have certain things, they're going to be even more hesitant to do certain things, and this can really stall them and stop them in their tracks. On top of just aggravating them and probably making them leave the room and just never see you again, because you've lost a friend by playing this, and that's exactly what this deck is for again. So for all those reasons, Telepathy, you are most definitely the Golden Pig of this deck. But now that we know what's in our opponent's hands, what are we going to do about that? Well, of course, we're going to be throwing a massive wrench into their plans by countering a ton of their spells. We're going to start with spells that cost 1 mana with cards like Spell Pierce, Annul, and Turn Aside. Spell Pierce is going to counter-target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Annul is going to counter-target artifact or enchantment spell, and Turn Aside is going to counter-target spell targets a permanent we control. So whether or not we have our commander in play, these are going to just cost a single mana and can help us out in a lot of situations. And then at 2 mana, which actually again with our commander in play is just 1 mana, we've got cards like Keep Safe, Negate, and Essence Scatter. Keep Safe is also going to counter-target spell targets a permanent we control, and on top of that we draw a card. Negate's going to counter-target non-creature spell, and Essence Scatter is going to counter-target creature spell. Next up, we've got Memory Lapse, which is going to counter a spell, but instead of putting it into the graveyard, it goes on top of that player's library. So it's kind of like a nice delay effect that makes a player waste quite a bit of mana on their spell, whereas again, if our commander's in play, we're just paying 1 for this. And speaking of wasting a lot of mana on a spell, well, Disdainful Stroke's going to counter-target spell with mana value 4 or greater. And then Flash Freeze is a bit more specific. We can counter-target red or green spell. Again, for just 1 mana, this can be a huge play. Finally, we've also got some counterspells like Mana Leak, Quench, and Lose Focus. Mana Leak's going to counter-target spells controller pays 3, Quench is the exact same thing, but the number is 2, and Lose Focus does the exact same thing as Quench, but we can also replicate it to make it cost even more for that opponent to pay. With the amount of counterspells that we have access to in this deck, we want to ensure that when we have a lot in our hand, we are picking the right one to utilize in the situation that we're in. So again, a more specific counterspell, again like a Flash Freeze, we're going to use to counter a red or green spell when we can, and then with these, well, if an opponent is just short on mana, we're going to want to utilize them. But of course, we're nowhere near done with talking about our counterspells just yet. Because next up we've got some counterspells that are going to cost 2 or more mana, well again, assuming that we've got Baral in play. Regardless, first up we've got Logic Knot, which has Delve, counter-target spells controller pays X. So again, Brawl is going to pay for at least 1 of that mana into that X, but yeah, if we've got some cards in our graveyard, we can get rid of them to ensure that our opponent can't pay for that spell. And again, with all the looting that our commander is going to help us do, well, we're going to have plenty of cards in our graveyard. Moving on, Calculated Dismissal is going to counter target spell its controller pays 3, and we pretty much are always going to have Spell Mastery with this deck, and yeah, if we've got 2 or more instant sorcery cards in our graveyard, we then scry 2. And speaking of value, well, Supreme Will is going to counter target spell its controller pays 3, or we can look at the top 4 cards of our library, put 1 of them into our hand, the rest of the bottom of our library in any order. Next up, we've got Flip the Switch, which is going to counter target spell its controller pays 4, and we get a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. Next up, there's Rakshas's Disdain, which is going to counter a spell its controller pays 1 for each card in our graveyard, and again, we can fill our graveyard really quickly with this deck. Next up, there's Exclude, which is going to counter target creature spell, and we draw a card. Additional card advantage on these spells is never a bad thing, again on top of our commander helping us loot for that card selection. Nevertheless, next up we've got Wizard's Retort, Stoic Rebuttal, and you find the Villain's Lair. Each of these can counter any spell. Wizard's Retort is going to cost 1 less if we control a wizard, and our commander is a wizard, which, already is going to have the reduction anyways. Regardless, next up there's Stoic Rebuttal, which is going to cost 1 less to cast if we control 3 or more artifacts, and you find the Villain's Lair is a flexible counterspell that says choose 1 counter target spell or draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Speaking of drawing cards, well, spell stuff is going to counter target spell, and if we've got 5 or less life, we draw a card. Then there's Bane's Contingency, which is going to counter a spell, and if that spell targets a commander we control, instead we counter it, scry 2, then draw a card. So if an opponent tries to get rid of Baral, well, we've got something to say about that. And then Dream Fracture is going to counter target spell, its controller draws a card, and so do we. Again, for this commander, essentially, every single one of our spells that cost 1 blue is basically just counterspell plus, because again, Baral's got our back and helps reduce that generic cost. So we're also going to be running Dissolve, which says counter target spell, scry 1, Sinister Sabotage, which is going to counter a spell and we surveil 1, and Neutralize, which we can cycle away, or we can counter target spell. And of course, additional card selection and some flexibility with that cycling is never a bad thing. Speaking of flexibility, next up there's Scatter to the Winds, which says counter target spell, and it's going to Awaken 3 for 4, blue. And then Saw It Coming has Foretell for 1 and a blue, and it's going to counter target spell, and this one is incredibly impactful because, well, we'll get to it here in a bit, but we do have another Foretell card, and essentially, whenever we have a Foretell card in play, our opponents are pretty much always going to assume it's Saw It Coming, even if it's not. And because of that, they are going to be even more hesitant to try to cast anything when we just have a Foretell in play, because they're going to know, or at least going to think they know, that that is a counter spell that can stop them from doing what they want to do. Next up, though, we've got Broken Concentration, which says counter target spell, and it's got Madness for 3 and a blue. So if we discard it away with an effect or a spell, we can make sure that we cast it as well to counter something. And finally, with our 3 mana counter spells, we've got Dissipate, Cancel, and Unwind. Dissipate's going to counter target spell, and then instead of putting it in the graveyard, it gets exiled. Cancel is just basically counter spell for this deck, and yeah, it's a very, very budget-friendly card, so that's why it made the cut. And Unwind says counter target non-creature spell, untap up to 3 lands. So with this one, not only do we counter a non-creature spell, but we also gain mana by doing so, because again, with Brawl in play, this just costs us 2 mana, and we essentially are going to get 3 back. Speaking of which, we are also going to be running Rewind, which says counter target spell, untap up to 4 lands. Also at 4 mana, we've got Dismiss, which says counter target spell, draw a card, and Statute of Denial, which says counter target spell if you control a blue creature, draw a card, then discard a card. Obviously, at the very least, our commander is blue, so yeah, we get even more looting with this. But yeah, in this deck, again, as you've seen, we are running an absurd amount of counter spells, so we can really throw incredible amounts of wrenches into our opponent's plans. But how are we actually going to get to all these cards? Well, on top of our commander's ability to help us loot, we also have some ways to provide us some card advantage with cards like Fact or Fiction, Deep Analysis, and Treasure Cruise. Fact or Fiction is going to have us reveal the top 5 cards of our library, and opponents separates those cards into 2 piles. We get one to our hand, the other into our graveyard. And then Deep Analysis says target player draws 2 cards, and we can flash it back by paying, well, again, if our commander's in play, just a blue and 3 life. And speaking of cost reduction, there's Treasure Cruise, which costs 7 and a blue, but it's got Delve, and it says draw 3 cards. So a lot of the time, we're just going to be paying a single blue mana to draw 3. Next up, we've got another way to loot a ton with this deck with Wind Rider Wizard. It says whenever you cast an instant, sorcery, or wizard spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. Moving on, we also have some enchantments that can help us out as well with Precognition Field, Future Sight, and Thought Reflection. Precognition Field says you may look at the top card of your library. You may cast the top card of your library if it's an instant or sorcery card, and by paying 3, we can exile the top card of our library. So now our opponents don't just have to worry about what's in our hand and what can counter their spells from there, but now they have to worry about the top of our library as well. And yeah, as you've seen so far, we're running an absurd amount of instants and sorceries in this deck. And of course, on top of that, if we've got a card on top that's a dead card, we can get rid of it if we really need to. Next up, Future Sight is somewhat similar, but it says play the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library. So this lets us play any card off the top of our library, including lands, and yes, it does have us reveal that to our opponents, but that can actually be a benefit for us. Because again, if we show a counter spell on the top of our library and our opponents know that we can cast that, well, they might be hesitant to play certain things. And then Thought Reflection can provide us an absurd amount of card advantage throughout the game. It says if you draw a card, draw 2 cards instead. So now when our commander helps us loot, we are actually gaining card advantage. Instead of just drawing 1, discarding 1, we draw 2, discard 1, so we're up 1 card every single time we counter a spell. You know, on top of helping us out with every single other one of our draws as well. Now that we've talked about digging deeper into our deck though, you might think that we're done with messing with our opponents, but we're not quite done with that just yet. So we're also going to be running some bounce spells like Unsubstantiate, Depart the Realm, and Blink of an Eye. Unsubstantiate can bounce a spell or creature back to its owner's hand. Depart the Realm has 4 Telepathy blue, so again, our opponents are probably going to think this is Saw It Coming, even though it is not. And anyways, it's going to return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. And then Blink of an Eye can also bounce target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and if it was kicked, we draw a card. Next up, there's Alchemist Retrieval, which can bounce target non-land permanent we control back to its owner's hand, or if we cleaved it, we can bounce any non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. And then Consuming Tide is going to make each player choose a non-land permanent they control, and every other non-land permanent gets bounced back to their owner's hands. Then we draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in their hand than us. But of course, we can also bounce a ton of things with Aether Gale, which is going to return 6 target non-land permanents back to their owner's hands. And keep in mind, again, when we're bouncing things back to our opponent's hands, well, we can just counter what they try to replay. But we can also shut our opponent's creatures down with something like Niblis of Frost. It says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, tap target creature an opponent controls, that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So this can really help us control things further. Now, as annoying as it would be not to have a win condition in this deck, well, we can still lose our friends with those win conditions too. So to put our opponents out of their misery, we are going to be running cards like Rise from the Tides, Tolerant Sky Summoner, and Murmuring Mystic. Rise from the Tides is going to make a 2/2 Black Zombie creature token for every single instant sorcery card in our graveyard, which again is going to be a ton. Just think about all those counterspells that we are running, plus, again, whenever we loot with our commander, we can put, more and more instants and sorceries in our graveyard as well. Yeah, this can make us a massive army out of nowhere. But we can also make a massive army over time, and a flying one at that with Tolerant Sky Summoner. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. And then Murmuring Mystic is similar. It says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 blue bird illusion creature token with flying. Regardless, with each of these, we can flood the board with a lot of evasive creatures. Finally though, an incredible card in this deck is Guile, which is a 6/6 elemental incarnation that says, it can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures, but more importantly, if a spell or ability you control would counter a spell, instead exile that spell, and you may play that card without paying its mana cost. Basically, our opponent's spells become ours, and again, with the amount of things that we can counter, yeah, this can give us an absurd amount of value throughout the game. And, of course, can also help us lose our friends, because now, not only are we countering our opponent's spells, but we're basically just gaining control of them. But now that we've talked about every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the lands. And our land base is very simple. With this mono blue deck, we are running islands. Who would have guessed that? Anyways, now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Like you saw in the thumbnail, in the description, in the title, and like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, this is a $13 deck. Okay, give me a break. $13.04. Now, do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of basic lands, but basic lands are incredibly cheap, or you might already have them, or you might be able to just get them for free at your LGS. And actually, you might be able to save even more with some extra potential savings by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. Though, do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show has come to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you, so make sure you comment below and let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.